The carriage rattled over uneven cobblestones as Elena pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass, watching the last threads of daylight dissolve behind the Carpathian peaks. The village of Sorov emerged from the twilight like a cluster of shadows, its crooked rooftops and narrow lanes huddled together as if seeking protection from the vast wilderness that surrounded them. She had left behind the familiar comforts of her late husband's estate in Vienna, trading gilded parlors and gaslights for this remote corner of Transylvania where grief might lose its grip on her heart. The driver, an old man with eyes like weathered stone, had said little during the journey, except to warn her that the roads beyond the village belonged to wolves and darker things still. Elena had nodded politely, dismissing his superstitions as the remnants of a bygone age. She was a widow of 32, educated and rational, and she did not believe in ghosts. The cottage she had rented stood at the edge of the village, separated from its nearest neighbor by a low stone wall and a stretch of overgrown garden. It was modest but sturdy, with whitewashed walls and shutters painted a fading blue. The landlord, a squat man named Petrescu, handed her the iron key with trembling fingers and muttered something about keeping the windows locked after dark. Elena thanked him and closed the door, grateful for the solitude. The interior smelled of lavender and dust, and the furniture was simple but well made. A narrow staircase led to a single bedroom overlooking the garden and the mountains beyond. She unpacked her few belongings, lit a fire in the hearth, and made herself a pot of tea. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stirrings of peace. That night she was awakened by the sound of footsteps on gravel. Her room was dark except for the pale wash of moonlight spilling through the window. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and peered through the glass. The garden was empty, but beyond the stone wall she saw a figure standing motionless on the terrace of the neighboring estate. The house itself was a ruin, or so it appeared, a crumbling manor of blackened stone with ivy crawling up its walls and empty windows staring like hollow eyes. Yet the terrace was intact, and upon it stood a man dressed in dark, formal attire, his face turned toward the sky, as if in silent communion with the stars. Elena's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and slender, his posture rigid with a kind of ancient dignity. His hair was black and swept back from a high, pale forehead, and though she could not see his features clearly from this distance, there was something in his stillness that unnerved her. He did not move, did not acknowledge her presence, and after several minutes she retreated from the window and returned to bed. But sleep eluded her and she lay awake until dawn, wondering who he was and why he stood alone in the ruins after midnight. The following evening, she asked Petrescu about the neighboring estate. The landlord's face tightened with unease, and he crossed himself before answering. The house had been abandoned for decades, he said, though some claimed it was still occupied by a reclusive nobleman who kept to himself and never ventured into the village. No one knew his name or where he had come from. Some whispered that he was cursed, that he had lived in that house for longer than any living memory could account for. Others said he was a scholar or an exile, a man who had withdrawn from the world to mourn some unspoken tragedy. Petrescu advised her to stay away from the ruins and to avoid the terrace after dark. Elena thanked him for the warning, but dismissed it as folklore. She was curious now, and curiosity had always been stronger than fear. That night she stood at her window again, and once more the figure appeared on the terrace. This time she lit a candle and placed it on the sill, a small gesture of acknowledgement. For a moment nothing happened. Then slowly the man turned his head toward her window. Even from that distance she felt the weight of his gaze, a pressure both unsettling and strangely intimate. He inclined his head in what might have been a nod or a bow, and then he turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the ruined house. Elena extinguished the candle and sat on the edge of her bed, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself it was foolish to be so affected by a stranger's presence, yet she could not deny the pull she felt, the inexplicable sense that something momentous had begun. The days passed in quiet routine. Elena spent her mornings exploring the village, purchasing bread and cheese from the market, and her afternoons reading by the fire. But as darkness fell, she found herself drawn to the window, waiting for the man to appear. He came every night without fail, always at the same hour, always alone. Sometimes he stood motionless for hours, his face tilted toward the moon. Other times he paced the length of the terrace with slow, deliberate steps, his hands clasped behind his back as if wrestling with some invisible burden. Eleanor began to feel as though she were watching a ritual, a private act of penance or meditation that she had no right to witness. Yet she could not look away. One night she decided to speak to him. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak and ventured into the garden, crossing the low stone wall that separated her property from his. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the distant howl of a wolf somewhere in the mountains. As she approached the terrace, the man turned to face her. Up close, he was even more striking than she had imagined. His features were sharp and aristocratic, his skin pale as porcelain, and his eyes, dark and depthless, held a sorrow so profound it seemed to weigh down the very air around him. He did not smile, but neither did he retreat. He simply watched her, waiting. Elena stopped at the edge of the terrace, suddenly uncertain. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the silence. "I did not mean to intrude. I have been staying in the cottage next door, and I could not help but notice your presence here each night." The man regarded her for a long moment before he spoke. His voice was low and measured, tinged with an accent she could not place. "You are not intruding," he said. "I am the one who lingers where I should not. This place belongs to the past, and I am merely its caretaker." Elena took a step closer. "Do you live here?" she asked. The man's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, a brief shadow of pain. "I exist here," he replied. "Whether that is the same as living, I cannot say." There was a silence between them, heavy and charged with unspoken questions. Eleanor felt a strange compulsion to stay, to learn more about this enigmatic figure who seemed so out of place in the modern world. "What is your name?" she asked. The man hesitated, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said very quietly, "I have had many names, but you may call me by the one I was given long ago. I am Dracula." The name struck her like a cold wind, and she took an involuntary step back. She had heard the legends, the stories whispered in dark corners about the vampire count who haunted the mountains of Transylvania. But standing before him now, seeing the weariness in his eyes and the loneliness etched into his features, she found it impossible to reconcile the monster of folklore with the man who stood before her. He must have seen the fear in her face, because he turned away, his shoulders sagging with resignation. "You should go," he said. "This is no place for the innocent." But Elena did not move. She thought of the grief that had brought her to this remote village, the hollow ache that had consumed her since her husband's death. She thought of the nights she had spent alone, wondering if she would ever feel alive again. And she thought of the man before her, a creature burdened by centuries of guilt and isolation, standing vigil in the ruins of his past. She did not know why, but she felt a kinship with him, a shared understanding of what it meant to be haunted by loss. "I am not afraid," she said, and she was surprised to find that it was true. Dracula turned back to her, and for the first time, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Then you are braver than most," he said, "or perhaps more foolish." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Perhaps both," she replied. They stood together on the terrace beneath the watchful gaze of the moon, two souls bound by sorrow and the fragile possibility of redemption. And in that moment, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The nights that followed became a secret ritual. Elena would wait until the village settled into sleep, then wrap herself in her cloak and cross the garden to the ruined terrace where Dracula stood watch over his crumbling domain. He never asked why she came, and she never offered an explanation. Their conversations began tentatively, brief exchanges about the weather or the mountains, but gradually deepened into something more substantial. He spoke in the careful manner of someone unaccustomed to human company, choosing his words as if each one carried weight he could not afford to squander. She listened with an attention she had not given anyone in years, drawn to the melancholy wisdom in his voice and the ancient sorrow that shadowed his every gesture. One night, as they stood beneath a sky crowded with stars, Eleanor asked him how long he had been alone. Dracula was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Longer than you can imagine," he said finally. I have walked this earth for centuries, watching empires rise and fall, watching mortals live and die while I remain unchanged. At first, I reveled in my immortality. I believed myself above the petty concerns of humanity, a god among insects. But time is a cruel teacher, and it taught me that eternity without purpose is not a gift, but a prison. I have seen everyone I ever cared for turn to dust. I have committed acts of such darkness that even now the memory of them weighs upon my soul like iron chains, and I have tried, in my own broken way, to atone for what I have done. But redemption is not so easily won. Elena felt a profound sadness settle over her as she listened. She thought of her own grief, the months she had spent drowning in the absence of her husband, and she realized that her suffering, though deep, was finite. It would fade with time, as all mortal pain eventually did. But Dracula's anguish was eternal, a burden he could never set down. "What did you do," she asked softly, "to carry such guilt?" Dracula turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the shadows of countless regrets. "I was a warrior once," he said, "a prince who defended his land against invaders and ruled with an iron hand. But war changes a man, and I became something monstrous long before the curse of immortality claimed me. I drank the blood of my enemies and reveled in their fear. I betrayed those who trusted me and destroyed those who loved me. And when I was finally transformed into what I am now, a creature of the night, I embraced the darkness fully. I terrorized villages, slaughtered innocents, and fed upon the very people I had once sworn to protect. For centuries, I was the thing that parents warned their children about, the nightmare that lurked in shadows, and I felt no remorse." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But then, one night, I looked into the eyes of a dying child, a girl no older than 10, and I saw my own reflection in her fading gaze. I saw the monster I had become, and for the first time in centuries, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. I felt shame. From that moment, I have tried to starve the beast within me, to deny the hunger that drives my kind. I have lived in isolation, feeding only on animals when the thirst becomes unbearable, and I have sworn never to take another human life. But the guilt remains, and it grows heavier with each passing year. I am damned, Elena, and no amount of penance will ever wash the blood from my hands." Elena reached out instinctively, her hand hovering near his arm, but she stopped herself before touching him. She did not know what to say. The enormity of his confession left her speechless, yet she did not recoil in horror as she might have expected. Instead, she felt a deep compassion for this tortured soul who had spent centuries alone, wrestling with the darkness within him. "You are still here," she said finally. "You have not surrendered to the beast. That must count for something." Dracula looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Does it?" he asked. "Or am I merely prolonging my damnation, clinging to a shred of humanity that no longer exists?" Elena shook her head. "I do not believe that. If you were truly lost, you would not feel remorse. You would not isolate yourself to protect others. You would not stand here night after night, searching the stars for something you cannot name. You are still capable of change, and that means you are still capable of redemption." Dracula stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled. It was a faint, fragile thing, barely visible in the moonlight, but it transformed his face. For an instant, the sorrow lifted, and she glimpsed the man he might have been before the curse claimed him. "You are kind," he said quietly. "Kinder than I deserve." Elena returned his smile. "Perhaps we are all kinder than we deserve," she replied. "We are all carrying burdens we did not ask for. My husband died 6 months ago, and I came here to escape the emptiness he left behind. I thought solitude would heal me, but instead I found you. And in your company, I feel less alone. Is that not a strange kind of grace?" They stood together in silence, the weight of their shared confessions hanging between them like a fragile bridge. Helena realized that she had not spoken so openly about her grief to anyone, not even to her closest friends in Vienna. There was something about Dracula's presence, his profound understanding of loss and suffering, that made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. And she sensed that he too was finding solace in their conversations, a reprieve from the endless solitude that had defined his existence for so long. As the nights passed, their bond deepened. Dracula began to share fragments of his past, stories of his mortal life as a prince and warrior, of the lands he had defended and the people he had loved. He spoke of his transformation, the night he drank from a forbidden chalice offered by a dark sorcerer in exchange for victory over his enemies. He described the agony of becoming something inhuman, the way his reflection vanished from mirrors and his soul seemed to wither within him. He told her of the centuries that followed, the blood-soaked years when he ruled over the shadows and commanded legions of the undead. And he spoke of the gradual awakening of his conscience, the slow, painful realization that he had become the very evil he had once fought against. Eleanor listened without judgment, her heart aching for the man trapped within the monster. She shared her own stories in return, memories of her marriage, the quiet happiness she had known and the crushing grief that followed her husband's sudden death. She confessed her fears that she would never feel whole again, that she would spend the rest of her life as a ghost haunting her own existence. Dracula listened with the same intense attention he had shown from the beginning, and in his presence, her sorrow felt less suffocating. One night, as they stood on the terrace beneath a full moon, Eleanor asked him if he ever regretted surviving for so long. Dracula considered the question carefully before answering. "Every day," he said. "There are moments when I wish I had perished in battle as a mortal man, when I could have died with honor and been laid to rest beside my ancestors. But then I think of nights like this, when I am not entirely alone, and I wonder if perhaps there is still some purpose to my existence. Perhaps I was meant to endure this curse, so that one day I might meet someone like you, someone who does not see me as a monster, but as a man struggling to reclaim his soul. If that is true, then perhaps my suffering has not been entirely without meaning." Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She reached out and for the first time placed her hand gently on his arm. His skin was cold beneath her touch, but she did not pull away. "You are not a monster," she said firmly. "You are a man who has made terrible mistakes, but you are also a man who is trying to atone for them. That is more than most people can say." Dracula looked down at her hand, and for a moment, she thought she saw moisture glisten in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing me as more than the sum of my sins." They remained on the terrace until the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains. Dracula stepped back into the shadows of the ruined house, and Elena returned to her cottage, her heart full of emotions she could not yet name. She knew that what was growing between them was dangerous, that it defied all logic and reason. But she also knew that for the first time since her husband's death, she felt truly alive. And as she lay in her bed watching the sunrise, she wondered if perhaps they were both on the edge of something miraculous, something that might redeem them both from the darkness that had claimed their lives. But beyond the village walls, in the narrow lanes and huddled cottages, whispers had begun to spread. Villagers spoke of strange shadows moving through the night, of livestock found drained of blood, of travelers who disappeared on the mountain roads and were never seen again. And in the cramped office of the village constable, a grim-faced policeman named Vasile reviewed reports that had begun to arrive from neighboring towns, reports of missing persons and unexplained deaths. He did not yet know the full truth, but he was beginning to suspect that something dark had awakened in the ruins beyond Elena's cottage, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The village of Sorov had always been a place where secrets festered beneath the surface, where old superstitions clung to the stones like moss, and every stranger was regarded with suspicion. But in the weeks since Elena's arrival, a new unease had settled over the narrow streets and shuttered windows. 3 travelers had vanished on the mountain roads, their horses found wandering without riders, their belongings scattered across the frost-covered ground. A shepherd discovered 2 of his sheep drained of blood, their throats torn open with a savagery that no wolf could match. And old Maria, who lived alone at the edge of the forest, swore she had seen a dark figure moving through the trees at night, a shape that seemed to dissolve into mist when she called out to it. The villagers gathered in hushed clusters at the market, exchanging theories and crossing themselves. And more than once, Elena heard the name Dracula whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. She tried to dismiss the rumors as hysteria, the product of isolated minds seeking patterns in random tragedy. But doubt had begun to gnaw at the edges of her certainty. She thought of the coldness of Dracula's skin beneath her touch, the way he vanished into the shadows before dawn, the centuries of bloodshed he had confessed to her. She wanted to believe that he had truly changed, that his vow to never harm another human was sincere. But what if the beast within him was stronger than his will? What if his presence in the village had awakened something dark and hungry that even he could not control? The questions tormented her, but she did not voice them aloud. Instead, she continued her nightly visits to the terrace, searching his face for signs of guilt or deception, and finding only the same melancholy loneliness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. One evening, as she prepared to leave her cottage, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Constable Vasily standing on her threshold, his broad face set in grim lines. He was a tall man with greying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent his life enforcing order in a place where chaos was never far away. He removed his hat and inclined his head respectfully. "Forgive the intrusion. Madam Kovacs," he said, using the formal address. "I need to ask you a few questions." Elena stepped aside to let him enter, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. "Of course, Constable," she said. "How can I help you?" Vasily entered the small parlor and declined her offer of tea. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. "I understand you have been living here for several weeks now," he said. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the area? Any strangers passing through? Or perhaps activity at the estate next door?" Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. "I've seen very little," she replied carefully. "The estate appears to be abandoned, though I have occasionally noticed someone on the terrace at night. I assumed it was the owner or a caretaker." Vasily's eyes narrowed. "And have you spoken to this person?" Elena hesitated, weighing her words. "Once or twice," she admitted. "He seemed harmless, a reclusive gentleman who prefers solitude. Why do you ask?" The constable's jaw tightened. "Because there have been disappearances. Madam Kovacs, 3 people in as many weeks, all last seen on the roads near this village. And there have been other incidents, livestock killed in ways that suggest something unnatural. The villagers are frightened, and they have begun to speak of old legends, of creatures that hunt in the darkness. I do not put much stock in superstition, but I cannot ignore the evidence. Something is happening here, and I intend to find out what." Elena felt a cold knot of fear settle in her stomach. "You think the man at the estate is responsible?" she said quietly. Vasily met her gaze. "I think it is worth investigating. If you know anything at all, I urge you to tell me now. Innocent lives may depend on it." Eleanor's mind raced. She thought of Dracula standing alone on the terrace, his face turned toward the stars, his voice heavy with remorse. She thought of the way he had spoken of his past, the genuine anguish in his confession. Could he truly be responsible for the recent tragedies? Or was he being blamed for crimes he did not commit, scapegoated by a community desperate for answers? She did not know, and the uncertainty was unbearable. "I do not believe he is dangerous," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "He has given me no reason to fear him." Vasily studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he could see through her evasion. "Very well," he said, "but I must ask you to be cautious, Madam Kovacs. Lock your doors at night, and if you see or hear anything suspicious, come to me immediately." Elena nodded, and the constable took his leave, but his words lingered long after he was gone. That night, Elena did not go to the terrace. She sat by her fire, staring into the flames, her mind a tempest of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe in Dracula's innocence, but she could not ignore the pattern of death that had followed his presence. She thought of the villagers, frightened and vulnerable, and she wondered if her compassion for a tormented soul had blinded her to the danger he might pose. But she also thought of the loneliness in his eyes, the weight of centuries pressing down on him, and she could not bring herself to condemn him without proof. Sleep eluded her, and as the hours stretched toward dawn, she made a decision. She would confront him directly, demand the truth, and force him to face the accusations that hung over him like a shroud. The following night, she crossed the garden with a resolve she had not felt before. Dracula was waiting on the terrace as always, but when he saw her approach, something in her expression made him stiffen. "You did not come last night," he said quietly, I feared I had offended you." Eleanor stopped at the edge of the terrace, her hands clenched at her sides. "The constable came to see me," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He spoke of disappearances, of deaths. The villagers are terrified and they believe you are responsible. Tell me the truth, Dracula. Have you broken your vow? Have you taken innocent lives?" For a moment Dracula said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Elena felt her heart breaking with every second that passed. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I have not," he said, and his voice was raw with pain. "I swear to you on whatever remains of my soul, I have not harmed a single person since you arrived in this village. I have kept to my vow, feeding only on the blood of animals, enduring the hunger that tears at me every night. But I cannot prove my innocence, Elena. I am what I am, and the world will always see me as a monster. If the constable comes for me, I will not resist. I am tired of running, tired of hiding. Perhaps it is time I faced the judgment I have evaded for so long." Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks. She believed him. She did not know why, but she believed him with a certainty that defied reason. "Then who is responsible?" she asked. "If not you, then who is killing these people?" Dracula's expression darkened. "I do not know," he said, "but I have sensed something in the mountains. A presence that does not belong. There are others of my kind, Elena, creatures who have not abandoned the thirst for human blood. It is possible that one of them has been drawn here, perhaps by my presence, perhaps by sheer chance. If that is true, then I must find them and stop them before more innocents die. But if I do so, I will be forced to reveal myself, and the villagers will hunt me regardless of my intentions." Elena stepped closer, her fear giving way to determination. "Then I will help you," she said. "We will find the truth together, and we will prove your innocence." Dracula looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. "You would risk yourself for me?" he asked. "After everything you have learned, after all the doubt you must feel?" Elena reached out and took his cold hand in hers. "Yes," she said simply, "because I believe you are capable of redemption, and because I cannot stand by and watch an innocent man be condemned. We will find whoever is responsible, and we will stop them. Together." Dracula stared at their joined hands, and then slowly he closed his fingers around hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." They stood together in the moonlight, bound by a fragile trust and the shared determination to uncover the truth. But neither of them knew that in the shadows beyond the terrace, something was watching. A figure cloaked in darkness with eyes that gleamed red in the night had been observing their meetings with growing interest. And as Elena and Dracula made their vow, the figure smiled, revealing fangs that glistened with fresh blood. The game had only just begun. The hunt began the following night. Dracula led Elena through the forest paths that wound into the mountains, moving with a silence that seemed unnatural. She struggled to keep pace, her breath coming in clouds of vapor in the frigid air, but she did not complain. She had insisted on accompanying him, and he had reluctantly agreed, warning her that what they might find would test her courage in ways she could not imagine. The moon hung low and swollen above them, casting silver light through the bare branches of ancient trees. The forest was eerily quiet, as if every creature had fled from some unseen predator. Only the sound of their footsteps and the distant howl of wind through stone crevices broke the oppressive silence. Dracula stopped at the edge of a ravine, his head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. "He is near," Dracula said quietly. "I can feel his presence, the corruption that clings to him like rot. He is young as our kind measures age, perhaps only a century or two, but he is reckless and hungry. He has not learned the discipline that comes with time, and he feeds without restraint." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "How do you know it is a he?" she asked. Dracula's expression was grim. "Because I recognize the pattern of his kills. He takes travelers on the roads, those who will not be missed immediately. He drains them completely, leaving nothing but husks. It is the behavior of a newly turned vampire, one who has not yet learned to control the bloodlust. I was like him once, centuries ago, and the memory fills me with shame." They descended into the ravine, picking their way carefully over loose stones and patches of ice. At the bottom they found what they were looking for. A cave mouth gaped in the rock face, its entrance partially concealed by a fallen tree and a tangle of dead vines. The smell that emanated from within was foul, a mixture of decay and something metallic that made Elena's stomach turn. Dracula placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. "Stay behind me," he said. "If things go badly, you must run and not look back, do you understand?" Elena nodded. Though she had no intention of abandoning him, she had come this far, and she would see it through to the end. They entered the cave, and the darkness swallowed them. Dracula moved with perfect confidence. His eyes adapted to the absence of light, but Elena had to feel her way along the rough stone walls. The passage widened into a chamber, and there, in the center, she saw the remnants of the missing travelers. Bodies lay in twisted heaps, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their skin pale and shriveled. Elena bit back a cry of horror, pressing her hand to her mouth. Dracula's jaw tightened, and she saw anger flash in his eyes, a cold fury that transformed his features into something terrifying. "This is the work of a monster," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I will end it." A voice echoed from the shadows, low and mocking. "Will you now, old one? How noble of you." A figure emerged from the deeper darkness of the cave, a young man with pale skin and wild eyes, his clothes stained with blood. He was handsome in a feral way, with sharp cheekbones and a cruel smile that revealed elongated fangs. He looked at Dracula with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "I have heard stories of the great Count Dracula," the figure said, his accent thick and eastern, "the prince who became a god of death, who ruled the night with absolute power. But look at you now, skulking in caves like a beaten dog, consorting with mortals as if you were one of them. How the mighty have fallen." Dracula stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and the vampire. "I know what I was," he said coldly, "and I know what I have become. But you are nothing but a rabid animal, a disgrace to our kind. You slaughter without purpose, without restraint, and you bring ruin upon us all." The young vampire laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Our kind? You speak as if we are part of some noble brotherhood. We are predators. Old man, we take what we want and we answer to no one. You have forgotten that in your pathetic quest for redemption, but I will remind you." He lunged forward with inhuman speed, his claws extended, aiming for Dracula's throat. What followed was a blur of violence that Elena could barely comprehend. The two vampires collided with a force that shook the cave, their movements too fast for her eyes to follow. Dracula fought with a controlled precision that spoke of centuries of experience, his strikes calculated and efficient. But the younger vampire was wild and unpredictable, driven by hunger and rage. They grappled and tore at each other, their fangs bared, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Elena pressed herself against the cave wall, her heart hammering in her chest, unable to look away from the savage spectacle before her. The young vampire managed to break free and turned his attention to Elena. "A mortal pet," he hissed, his lips curling into a sneer. "How touching. Perhaps I will drain her in front of you, let you watch as I take everything you care about." He moved toward her with terrifying speed, but Dracula was faster. He seized the younger vampire by the throat and slammed him against the cave wall with such force that the stone cracked. "Enough!" Dracula roared, and his voice was no longer that of a man, but of something ancient and terrible. "You will not touch her." The young vampire struggled, clawing at Dracula's grip, but he could not break free. Dracula's face was a mask of fury and pain. "I did not want this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did not want to become the monster again, but you have left me no choice." With a single brutal motion, he drove his hand into the young vampire's chest and tore out his heart. The creature let out a shriek that echoed through the cave, and then his body crumbled to ash, disintegrating into nothingness. Dracula stood over the remains, his shoulders heaving, his hand still clutching the withered heart. Then he let it fall, and it too turned to dust. Elena approached him slowly, her legs trembling. "Dracula," she said softly. He turned to her, and she saw that his eyes were filled with tears. "I killed him," he whispered. "I swore I would never take another life, and I broke that vow. I'm no better than he was." Elena shook her head. "You saved my life," she said firmly, "and you stopped him from killing anyone else. What you did was necessary, not monstrous. You are not the same as him. You never were." Dracula looked at her with an expression of such profound anguish that it broke her heart. "How can you be so certain?" he asked. "How can you look at me and not see the beast?" She reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the coldness of his skin and the tension in his jaw. "Because I see you," she said. "Not the vampire, not the legend, but you. The man who has fought for centuries to reclaim his soul. The man who stands watch every night, alone and grieving, because he cannot bear to cause more suffering. You are not perfect, Dracula. You have made terrible mistakes, and you carry scars that will never heal. But you are trying, and that makes you more human than most people I have ever known." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, and for a moment they stood together in the darkness, surrounded by death, but clinging to something fragile and precious. They left the cave and returned to the village as dawn approached. Dracula walked her to the edge of her garden, but he did not cross the wall. "The constable will come for me," he said. "Once the bodies are found, once the truth is revealed, they will not distinguish between the vampire who killed innocents and the one who stopped him. They will see only monsters, and they will hunt me." Elena felt panic rising in her chest. "Then leave," she said urgently. "Go now before they find you. Find someplace safe where you can start again." Dracula shook his head. "I am tired of running, Elena. I have been fleeing from my past for centuries, and it has brought me nothing but more loneliness. If I am to be judged, then let it be here, in the place where I finally found someone who believed I could be more than a monster." Elena grasped his hand, her eyes pleading. "You cannot give up now," she said. "Not after everything we have been through. I will speak to the constable. I will make him understand." Dracula smiled sadly. "Your compassion is extraordinary," he said, "but some things cannot be changed by words alone. Go inside, Elena. Lock your doors and forget about me. Live the life you deserve, free from the shadow of the damned." He turned to leave, but she held onto his hand, refusing to let go. "I will not forget you," she said fiercely, "and I will not let them take you without a fight." Dracula looked at her for a long moment, and then he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, cold and gentle. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for everything." Then he pulled away and disappeared into the fading darkness, leaving her alone in the garden as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. Elena stood there for a long time, her heart heavy with dread. She knew that the battle was not over, that the constable would soon learn the truth, and that Dracula's fate hung by the thinnest of threads. But she also knew that she would not abandon him, no matter the cost. She had found something rare and precious in his company, a connection that transcended the boundaries of mortality and monstrosity, and she would fight to protect it, even if it meant standing against the entire world. The constable arrived at dawn with 6 armed men, their faces set with grim determination. Elena heard their boots on the cobblestones and rushed to her window to see them marching toward the ruined estate, torches blazing despite the growing daylight. Her heart seized with terror. She threw on her cloak and ran out into the garden, calling after them, but they did not stop. Constable Vasile turned only long enough to gesture for her to stay back, his expression warning her not to interfere. But Elena had made a promise, and she would not break it now. She followed them across the stone wall and onto the terrace where she and Dracula had spent so many nights in quiet conversation. The men stormed into the ruined manor, their voices echoing through the empty halls. Elena rushed after them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She found them in the great hall, a cavernous room with a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with rotting tapestries. Dracula stood in the center, calm and unresisting, his hands at his sides. He was dressed in the same dark, formal attire he always wore, and his face was composed, almost serene. He looked at Elena as she burst through the doorway, and something like regret flickered in his eyes. "I told you to stay away," he said softly. "This does not concern you anymore." But Elena pushed past the constable and positioned herself between Dracula and the armed men. "It does concern me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You are making a terrible mistake. This man is innocent of the crimes you suspect him of. The true killer is dead, destroyed in the mountains. I was there. I witnessed it." Constable Vasile's expression hardened. "Step aside, Madam Kovacs," he said. "This creature is dangerous, and we have evidence linking him to the disappearances. We found the bodies in a cave, just as he said we would, but that does not absolve him. He is a vampire, an abomination, and the law is clear. He must be destroyed." Elena felt tears streaming down her face. "He saved those people from suffering any further," she said desperately. "He stopped the one who was killing them. He has lived for centuries without harming anyone, fighting every day to control the curse that was forced upon him. If you kill him, you are not delivering justice. You are committing murder." The constable's jaw tightened, but one of the men behind him spoke up, his voice uncertain. "She speaks with conviction, Vasile. Perhaps we should hear what the creature has to say before we act." The constable hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Very well. Speak, monster. Defend yourself if you can." Dracula looked at the men gathered before him, their faces filled with fear and hatred, and he felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. He had known this moment would come eventually, that he could not hide from judgment forever, but now that it was here he felt a strange sense of peace. "I will not defend myself," he said quietly. "Everything you have heard about me is true. I am a vampire, a creature of darkness who has taken countless lives over the centuries. I have been a terror and a scourge upon the world, and no words can wash away the blood on my hands. If you wish to destroy me, I will not resist. I am tired, and I have no desire to prolong this existence any further." Elena cried out in anguish. "No, you cannot say that. You have changed. You have fought so hard to become something better." Dracula turned to her, and his expression was filled with a tenderness that nearly broke her. "I have tried, Elena," he said. "For your sake, I have tried. But trying is not the same as succeeding. I am still what I am, and the world has no place for creatures like me. Perhaps it is better this way. Perhaps it is time I faced the consequences of my sins and found whatever peace awaits beyond this cursed existence." Elena shook her head, her vision blurred by tears. "You cannot give up," she whispered. "Not now. Not when you are so close to redemption." Constable Vasile raised his hand, and the men behind him readied their weapons, wooden stakes and silver blades blessed by the village priest. But before they could act, an old woman pushed her way through the crowd. It was Maria, the shepherd's wife, her face lined with age and her eyes sharp with memory. "Wait," she commanded, her voice surprisingly strong. "You would kill this man without knowing the full truth? I have lived in this village for 70 years, and I remember the stories my grandmother told me, stories of a dark lord who once ruled these mountains with terror. But I also remember the stories of how he changed, how he withdrew from the world and swore to harm no one. My grandmother said that he saved her life once, when she was lost in the mountains as a child. A wolf pack surrounded her, and he drove them away, then carried her back to the village without asking for anything in return. She never forgot his kindness, and she made me promise to remember it. If this is the same man, then perhaps he deserves mercy, not death." The constable looked at the old woman, then back at Dracula. "Is this true?" he asked. "Did you save a child in these mountains decades ago?" Dracula nodded slowly. "I did," he said. "I remember her. She was terrified, and I could have taken her life easily. But I chose not to. I suppose that was the first time I realized I still had a choice, that I was not entirely a slave to the beast within me. It was a small thing, but it mattered to me." The constable's expression softened slightly, though his grip on his weapon did not waver. "One act of kindness does not erase a lifetime of evil," he said, "but it does complicate matters." Elena seized the moment. "Then let him prove himself," she said urgently. "Do not kill him now, not when he has the chance to do more good. Let him live, and let him continue to fight the darkness within him. If he ever harms another innocent, you can hunt him down then. But give him this chance, please, I am begging you." The constable looked at her, then at Dracula, and finally at the men around him. They were no longer as certain as they had been moments before. Doubt had crept into their faces, and Maria's testimony had shaken their resolve. After a long silence, Vasile lowered his weapon. "I will not kill you today," he said to Dracula. "But you must leave this place and never return. If I ever hear of deaths that bear your mark, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and finish what I should have done here. Do you understand?" Dracula bowed his head. "I understand," he said, "and I thank you for your mercy, though I am not certain I deserve it." The constable turned to Elena. "And you, Madame Kovac, you would be wise to forget this creature and return to your life. Nothing good can come from consorting with the damned." Then he gestured to his men, and they filed out of the hall, leaving Elena and Dracula alone. Elena rushed to him and threw her arms around him, sobbing against his chest. "I thought they would kill you," she said. "I thought I would lose you." Dracula held her gently, his cold hand stroking her hair. "You should have let them," he said quietly. "It would have been easier for both of us." But Elena pulled back and looked up at him fiercely. "I will never let that happen," she said. "You are worth fighting for, Dracula. You are worth saving." He looked at her with an expression of wonder and sorrow. "You have given me something I thought I had lost forever," he said. "You have given me hope, but now I must leave, as the constable commanded. I cannot stay here any longer, not without bringing more danger to you and this village." Elena felt her heart breaking. "Then I will come with you," she said. "Wherever you go, I will follow." Dracula shook his head. "No, Elena. You belong in the world of the living, among people who can give you the warmth and companionship you deserve. I am a shadow, a relic of a forgotten age, and I have nothing to offer you but darkness and loneliness. You must stay here and rebuild your life. Find happiness again. Fall in love again. Live the years you have been given. Do not waste them on me." Elena grasped his hands desperately. "But I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I do not care what you are or what you have been. I love you, and I cannot bear the thought of living without you." Dracula closed his eyes, and a single tear rolled down his pale cheek. "And I love you, Elena," he whispered, "more than I have loved anyone in centuries. But that is precisely why I must leave. You deserve a life, a future, children and grandchildren, and all the joys that mortality brings. I cannot give you those things. I can only give you an eternity of watching you age and die while I remain unchanged. I will not condemn you to that fate." Elena wanted to argue, to insist that she would rather have a few years with him than a lifetime without him. But she saw the resolve in his eyes and knew that nothing she said would change his mind. They stood together in the ruined hall as the morning light filtered through the broken windows. Dracula leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and filled with unbearable sadness. It was a goodbye, and they both knew it. When he pulled away, he whispered, "Thank you, Elena. Thank you for seeing me as more than a monster. Thank you for believing that even the damned can be redeemed. I will carry the memory of you with me for all the centuries to come, and it will be the light that guides me through the darkness." Then he turned and walked out of the hall, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, and Elena watched him go, her heart shattering with every step he took. She did not follow him. She stood there alone, her tears falling silently, until the sound of his footsteps faded entirely. Then she returned to her cottage and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The days that followed were hollow and grey. She went through the motions of living, but her heart remained in that ruined hall, in those stolen nights on the moonlit terrace. The villagers spoke of the vampire who had been driven away, and they praised the constable for his mercy and wisdom. But Elena said nothing. She kept her grief private, a secret she shared with no one. Months passed, and winter gave way to spring. Elena remained in the village, tending her small garden and walking the mountain paths alone. She never saw Dracula again, but sometimes on clear nights when the moon was full, she would stand at her window and look toward the ruined estate. And she would whisper his name into the darkness, hoping that somewhere, somehow, he could hear her. She never remarried, never sought the companionship the constable had urged her to find. She had known a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death, and she would carry it with her until her last breath. Years later, when Elena was old and her hair had turned silver, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page, written in elegant script. It read, "I have not forgotten you. I have kept my vow, and I have harmed no one. The memory of your compassion has sustained me through the darkest nights, and I am grateful beyond words for the gift you gave me. I hope you have found happiness, Elena, and I hope you know that you saved me, not from death, but from despair. You taught me that redemption is possible even for the damned. Thank you always. There was no signature, but Elena knew who had written it. She held the letter to her heart and wept, not with sorrow but with a bittersweet joy. She had loved a monster, and in doing so she had helped him become a man. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift either of them could have received. She passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later, a faint smile on her lips. And on the night of her funeral, the villagers reported seeing a dark figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, his head bowed in silent mourning. He remained there until dawn, and then he was gone, vanished into the mists like a dream. But those who saw him swore that he had been weeping, and that his tears, when they fell, glistened like diamonds in the moonlight.